Have you ever stopped to think about how much of who you are is actually you, and how much is just a reflection of the world you live in? We're about to dive into this really powerful and often invisible force, the way our environment shapes how we think, how we act, and even how we see other people. Let's get into it.
So, right off the bat, I've got a question for you. Do you see yourself as the captain of your own ship, totally guided by your personality? Or are you maybe more like a sailboat, constantly adjusting to the winds and the currents all around you? That's really the core idea we're going to unpack here. All right, so let's tackle that big question head on. Personality versus environment. It's this fundamental tug of war, right? The person you think you are, against all the pressures of the world you actually live in. So which one usually gets the final say?
You know, we love to think our personality is this solid, unchangeable thing. Like, if you're an outgoing person, you're always outgoing. But is that really true? I mean, think about it. Even the most confident, talkative person you know probably quiets down in a library or gets a little more formal at a super strict job. See? They're adjusting to the rules. So your personality, it's less of a concrete blueprint and more like a really smart program, always tweaking itself based on the signals it's getting from the outside world.
And what's guiding all these little adjustments? Well, you could call them the invisible rules. These aren't laws written down anywhere. They're the subtle, unspoken social cues that shape what we do every single day, most of the time without us even realizing it.
One of the biggest ways we follow these rules is through something called self-censorship. Now, that sounds pretty heavy, but honestly, we all do it. It's that little moment where you think, nah, better not share that opinion in this meeting, or when you bite your tongue at a family dinner to keep the peace. It's basically a social survival skill, a way we learn to navigate our world and, avoid trouble.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. When those invisible rules get tighter and more restrictive, whether that's in a whole country, an office, or even a family, people just naturally learn to be more careful. It's a totally logical response. You figure out really fast what's okay to say and what's not. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just a temporary thing, like putting on a different hat. When you have to hold back all the time, for years and years, it can actually start to reshape your core personality. That constant need to be careful can turn someone who was once really open and direct into someone who's much more reserved. So the environment doesn't just change what you do, it can actually change who you are.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. We've been talking about how individuals adapt, but what happens when you apply this idea to entire cultures or societies? Well, this is where you start to see how wildly different our ideas of normal can actually be. What feels totally natural to you might seem completely bizarre to someone from a different background, and the other way around.
This chart just lays out the difference so clearly. In what you'd call a high-freedom environment, speaking your mind is the default. You don't really think twice about it. Trust is higher. You might ask a total stranger to watch your laptop for a second. Freedom is kind of like the air you breathe. It's just there. But in a low-freedom environment, every interaction is a calculation. Self-censorship is the default. Trust is something you only give to a very small, tight circle. Just speaking up requires a whole risk assessment. We're talking about two completely different operating systems for daily life. And for the people living in them, each one feels totally normal.
So what happens when people from these two very different worlds try to communicate? Well, you can probably guess. You get friction. You get a lot of confusion. This is where those worlds collide. And the root of the problem is a very basic human thing. We all use our own life as a measuring stick. When we hear someone else's story, our first instinct is to hold it up against our own reality to see if it makes sense to us.
So what happens when a story is way outside of our own personal experience? Well, our brain tends to flag it as unrealistic. If you've never had to worry about what you say in public, hearing from someone who does might just sound like they're exaggerating. This is where so much misunderstanding comes from. It's not usually about malice, it's just a complete lack of a shared frame of reference. And oh boy, does social media pour gasoline on this fire. It feeds us these tiny, context-free snippets of other people's realities. We see a 15-second clip of a cultural moment without any of the history or meaning behind it, and our brains, well, they're wired to jump to an immediate and often totally wrong conclusion.
So, what's the solution? How do we stop this cycle of misunderstanding? The key is to consciously build what we could call an empathy bridge. It's about making an intentional effort to close that gap between our world and someone else's.
And how do we build this bridge?
Well, it really boils down to three things. First, just listen and try to turn off that little voice in your head that's constantly judging and comparing. Second, truly accept that another person's reality is just as real and valid to them as yours is to you. And third, and this is the hardest one, you have to actively try to step outside of your own experience, your own bubble.
Because that's really the heart of it. Real empathy isn't about feeling sorry for someone. It's about respecting the fact that the world just doesn't work the same way for everybody. It's about being able to say, my normal isn't your normal, and being completely okay with that.
So I'll leave you with one last thing to think about. Is it actually possible to build that empathy bridge from a distance? Or is living there, that firsthand experience, the only way to ever truly understand another person's world? That's a big one to chew on. Thanks so much for tuning in.